Welcome, everyone. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. And I'm always very intrigued to know who has never, ever been in the building before. Would you raise your hand? Oh, neat. Oh, wow, that's fabulous. Please come back. We have all these wonderful things. You can look on your chairs and see the incredible events that are happening. But tonight, welcome to the second annual Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day celebration. First Freed, celebrating African American life in Washington, D.C. And it is a real pleasure to be gathered here to look at this very important Emancipation Day celebration, which started today and will go through the weekend. Take a moment to turn off your mobile devices, if you would. Please join me in thanking our fabulous sponsors, the Executive Office of the Mayor, the Humanities Council of DC, the American Historical Association, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and Uber, who has come back for a second year because the first year was so successful. I think you can get a free Uber ride if you look on the agenda at a glance on your chairs. And please join me in thanking our Blue Ribbon Advisory Board, Dr. Edna Green Medford, Professor and Chairperson of the Department of History at Howard University, Dr. G. Derek Musgrove, who is here this evening, Associate Professor, Department of History, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Dr. Jim Grossman, who is the Executive Director of the American Historical Association. They worked really, really long, hard, and substantively with our humanities scholar, Dr. Sharita Thompson, and our programming consultant, Marianne Brownlow, to really tease out topics that would shed a different light on the conversations that we'll have this weekend. But now, let me turn this microphone over to the Honorable Charles Allen, who is the council member who represents Ward 6 and who has been, in fact, a real fairy godfather for this particular project and has gathered support from all corners of the city. And I can't thank you enough, so please come. Welcome, folks.
Thank you. I don't have wings, so I'll just walk. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and really, thank you so much for organizing this. I had the pleasure of being here last year when we kind of kicked this off, and one of the things that it was a wonderful series, wonderful conversation, and what it lacked, though, really was actually being in full partnership with the city for all of our Emancipation Day commemorations, and that was something that really our organizers brought to us and said, how do we make that happen? And I felt really strongly that when we think about Emancipation Day in the district, it's got to be more than just a really great parade downtown. How do we make it beyond the parade is kind of what we kept thinking about. This is a story that's incredibly important to our city. It's incredibly important to our history, to every single person here. And we wanted to think about ways that we take this story, we take this conversation out into our neighborhoods. And I can think of no better way than to have the Hill Center and the partnership that you've created to really help bring this out off Pennsylvania Avenue and really into our communities, into our neighborhood. And I really appreciate the Secretary of the District, Lauren Vaughn, who I approached her. I pushed a little bit, and she agreed and really helped bring this in, and I think that means a lot. I was also rolling around my head a little bit thinking about this of how do you turn something from not just being a celebration, but to also be a commemoration? Because the parade is kind of the celebration. The conversation is a way that we actually commemorate what Emancipation Day is and what it means. And maybe it's because I don't read enough fiction. I'm reading a Washington history book right now. I think it's Tom Lewis is the author. And it's really, right now, where I am in the book right now, it's talking about the formation of our city. And to me, at least, got poignant kind of as the chapters I've been recently reading. And we're talking about the 1790s and 1800 as the district is literally being formed and shaped as it is. And in 1802, I'm just going to drop a little history but not bore you, I promise. In 1802, we had our first mayor, Robert Brent, who has a school named just a couple blocks away from here. That was appointed by Thomas Jefferson and did a lot of things. Got the first fire engine for the city, drained some stagnant water, led the finances and all of that. But also in 1808, he, as the mayor, and with the commission or their version of a council, also passed the first black codes for DC. which meant that no free black could walk in the city past 10 p.m. Interestingly, could also not play a game with a ball. But it really spoke to, as I was reading, it really struck how from the very beginning of our city, the very beginning of the District of Columbia, race divided and was absolutely an integral part of the way in which our city operated and the foundation upon which it was laid. And so we cannot commemorate and really get to the point of celebrating an Emancipation Day without being able to talk about race and democracy. And that's why I think this panel is going to be fantastic. It's something that you can't shy away from. You got to be able to just go straight into it and have a really thoughtful conversation. And that's what I think the organizers have really helped pull together so that conversation can be part of what we have. It's what our city needs. And I really appreciate the thought and the conversation that's going to take place tonight. So thank you all for being a part of it. I know there are more events throughout the weekend that'll be taking place as well. I think there's a walking tour tomorrow. There's more events on Sunday. So thank you to everybody. You can come down to the parade if you'd like. That will also be at 1 o'clock tomorrow downtown on Pennsylvania Avenue. But I hope that you'll really take advantage of all these great programs that'll here at the Hill Center. And thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Okay, just some quick housekeeping. The format will be a conversation and then a brief Q&A following it. We'll pass around a microphone because we are taping this for our YouTube channel, and we want to make sure that everyone can hear what's going on. And we have evaluations on your chairs, and we would really appreciate it at the end if you would fill them out. We want to improve this, and we really value your comments. So if you would take a moment, I would appreciate it. It's a pleasure to introduce the forum's subject matter expert, a member of the advisory board, Dr. Sharita Jacobs-Thompson, to introduce this evening's program. Dr. Thompson is a former assistant professor of Civil War era studies and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. Currently, thankfully for us, she is an independent scholar and consultant in the Washington, D.C. area. Her research focuses on the African-American experience during the American Civil War and Reconstruction era, particularly in our environs in the District of Columbia and Maryland. So she is the perfect person to introduce this panel.
Thank you so much. So welcome to our first panel of the second Benjamin Drummond Emancipation Day celebration, Race and Democracy in Washington, D.C. from the Civil War through World War II. So again, thank you for coming out, and I have the honor tonight to present our panel to you. So first, let me go ahead and introduce Dr. George Derrick Musgrove. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is the author of Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics, which is on sale here, and he'll be happy to sign those for you afterwards, as well as a number of popular and scholarly articles on the post-civil rights era and Washington, D.C. politics. Dr. Musgrove is currently at work on the history of race and democracy in Washington, D.C. with his co-panelist, Chris Myers-Asch. He received his PhD in U.S. history from New York University in 2005. We also have Dr. Chris Myers-Asch, a native of Washington, D.C. Dr. Asch teaches history at Colby College and serves as editor of Washington History Magazine. He taught with Teach for America in rural Mississippi and co-founded the Sunflower County Freedom Project. He earned his PhD from the University of North Carolina and wrote The Senator and Sharecropper, The Freedom Struggles of James O. Eastland and Fannie Lou Hamer, which is also on sale, and he will also be happy, right, Chris, to sign those afterwards. He is currently working with Dr. Musgrove on Chocolate City, Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. He and his wife have 3 lovely children. Let me add that. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Colbert I. King. Mr. King writes a column, sometimes about D.C., sometimes about politics, that runs on Saturdays. In 2003, he won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, quote, for his against the grain columns that speaks to people in power with ferocity and wisdom, end quote. He is also a regular panelist on ABC's Inside Washington and a regular commentator commentator on WTOP radio. King joined the Post editorial board in 1990 and serves as deputy editorial page editor from 2000 to 2007. King grew up in Washington, D.C. and attended Howard University. He is married to Gwendolyn Stewart King and has 3 adult sons. So, without further ado, please help me welcome our panelists for this evening.
The 1862 Act that freed slaves here in the District of Columbia was received with obviously great joy, not only by the ex-slaves but also the abolitionists who had worked so hard. But I think there's a person who had an equal amount of joy. His name was George Washington Young. He was here in the district, here in the southeast section of the district. Nobody probably could have been more excited than he was. But he wasn't a slave. He was a slave owner, a planter here in the city. And the reason he was happy is because the act that freed the slaves here compensated slave owners. And as I recall, he owned 69 slaves. The federal government decided to pay the 966 slave owners for their slaves. The number was about 3,100. And they were going to pay the appraised value. Here's why George Washington Young was euphoric. He received $17,771 for his loss. Get an idea what that meant. $1 in 1862 would be worth $23.70 today. His payment would be worth a cool $421,000. That's why emancipation made this slave owner a most happy slave owner. Why do I tell this story? Because this is one of the peculiarities of the District of Columbia when it comes to race. Nowhere else in the nation was any other jurisdiction compensated for doing that. They sort of had it the other way around. It seems to me you get compensated when something bad happens to you, and the compensation is supposed to be the good. The bad was slavery, and the bad ones won out. They were enriched by this, officially, by the federal government. And this is something I think that we're going to hear this evening, the peculiar relationship of race to our development in this city. Things happen here that don't happen anywhere else, although they're related to race. And that's the part I want to sort of focus on. And it gets right to the question of enfranchisement. How did we get disenfranchised? You want to take a shot at that, Derek?
Which time? So the first time around is, of course, when Congress comes to town. And so you're talking about the years 1801, or year 1801. Congress gets here in 1800. They pass the Organic Act the next year. And during the time that the Capitol was being built, right, so roughly 1790 to 1801, people who live in the District of Columbia are governed by the laws of the states that had donated land to make the District of Columbia. So that's Virginia and Maryland. And so in 1794 election, 1796 election, folks on this side of the Potomac River would head up to Bladensburg, cast their vote. They have the same access to representation as anyone else within the states. After 1801 and the Organic Act, they're stripped of the franchise. and they do not have access to local office or to federal office at all. The reason for that is really a political fight between the Democrats and the Federalists. The Federalists, after the Democratic sweep in 1800, wanted to get all this legislation through Congress really quickly that would build up a strong centralized federal government that they thought was the key to a healthy republic. Democrats had this idea of a relatively weak federal government, making sure that power remains with the common man out in the states. And so they passed all of this legislation really at the last minute. And one of the pieces of legislation that they got through was the Organic Act that, of course, set up the rules for the District of Columbia. And so, you know, those people who have studied this in real depth, I mean, we're using a lot of scholars' information that sort of comes to us through secondary sources, have basically concluded that this was a political push to just get the Federalists' agenda through. They didn't think that much about how it would affect the District of Columbia over time. Don't get me wrong, there were large numbers of people in Congress who really believed that this was the best dispensation. But when it came down to it, the debate was relatively short. And it was one in which people essentially said, don't worry, Congress will take care of you. You'll have the best city council in the land.
Chris?
And so, from the beginning, there are people in D.C., local people in D.C. who object, as people are to this day, from the mayor on down, objecting to this situation because, of course, they had just fought a revolution about this exact topic, right? That, you know, within their memory, they'd fought against taxation without representation, and here their own government was imposing it upon them. And so you had people like this eccentric guy named Augustus Woodward, who later gained fame more in Michigan. He's one of the founders of the University of Michigan. I know we have a Michigan person in the audience, and one of their first Supreme Court justices. But in D.C., he's a young man, he's a young lawyer, and he really objects to this usurpation of power. And he's really worried that Congress is just going to forget about D.C., that the national is always going to overwhelm the local, and that Congress is not going to be a very good state legislature because they don't care very much about D.C. This is a time when Congress really doesn't spend that much time in D.C. They're only here a couple months of the year, and then they go back home. Now Congress is always here. We can't get rid of them. But at this time they were only here for short pieces of time, periods of time, and they didn't really care about the city. And so there was enough local protest that they did get amendments to the bill, and over time, subsequent amendments to the Organic Act. So you would get a popularly elected mayor and a popularly elected city council that runs through the Civil War era. And the Civil War era becomes this tremendous crucible in so many different ways, but especially here in the district, because with emancipation comes a revolution, many revolutions simultaneously. And one of them has to do with the franchise, because the radical Republicans who wrote the Emancipation Bill of 1862 follow that up by passing a law establishing public schools in the District of Columbia. They want the District of Columbia to become an example for all the land. They want the District of Columbia to be the model city, the example for what's going to happen to the rest of the country, to the rest of the South in particular. And particularly on issues of race. And so when the war ends in 1865, one of the first things that the former abolitionists, now many of them are radical Republicans, and their black allies certainly in this city, they put suffrage at the top of their agenda, suffrage for black men. And it actually becomes the bill number 1 in 1865. This becomes the issue that radical Republicans want to make in the post-war world, because this is going to be the key to their Reconstruction policy throughout the South. Because if you have political power in the hands of black men, they figure that those black men are going to cast ballots for the party of Lincoln, for the Republican Party, and this is going to ensure the strength of the Republican Party. And so this becomes a tremendous battle first fought in D.C. And later fought across the South. But the battle for black suffrage dominates all the political oxygen. It sucks up all the political oxygen in 1865-66 as the radical Republicans are seizing this opportunity, a very short-lived opportunity, as it turns out, as they understood that they had a small window of time to push through these really important ideas. And they did. They got it passed. Over President Johnson's veto, he vetoes it, and they come right back the next session and pass it again. And so in 1867, you have black men in Georgetown. In February 1867, the first elections where black men can vote. And this initiates an entire a transformative era in D.C. politics. All of a sudden, you have ex-slaves casting ballots, ex-slaves eventually running for office. You have guys like George Hatton, born of slaves in Prince George's County. He actually, talk about peculiar, his father bought him when he was a slave, but never filed the freedom papers because freedom papers were expensive. And so this happened a lot. He was saving the money to buy out the rest of his family. So Hatton's father owns Hatton and his brothers. So when the Emancipation Act comes along, he says, well, I'm going to get compensated for it, So he goes and his own sons are freed, and he gets paid by the federal government to do that. George Hatton is a Union veteran. He comes back wounded at the Battle of Petersburg, and he says, I have earned this right. I demand this right to vote. And he is involved, like a lot of black Union veterans are involved in this push for suffrage. When they win it, he says, well, now I'm going to run. And he runs, and he wins a seat on the city council. By 1869, you have black men representing, on the city council, holding office in every different ward in the city. I mean, it's a tremendous revolution. You have a former abolitionist, a white man named Sales Bowen, who's mayor, who wins in the mayor's election of 1868. And so you have completely upended the way the city was politically in the antebellum era. And it's out of this transformation, out of this revolution, that we get the disfranchisement that we know today, because this inspires a political backlash, a white backlash, essentially, from the likes of W.W. Corcoran, of Corcoran Art Gallery, like George Riggs, formerly, the Riggs Bank that lasted until PNC bought it out a few years ago. These were men who were very conservative, who objected to emancipation in the first place, objected to public schools in the second place, objected to suffrage in the third place. They objected to any step towards equality. And they joined forces with men like Alexander Shepard, who was a businessman, an opportunist, owned the Evening Star. He gets involved in the movement to create a different kind of government, a territorial government, which the Congress establishes in 1871, which is a step away from elective of full representation and full elected office, where most of the power is in the hands of this appointed Board of Public Works, which doesn't sound like it should be a very powerful organization, but it becomes one because Alexander Shepard makes it one.
This is Boss Shepard.
This is Boss Shepard of Shepard Park, an elementary school, and all the rest. And he transforms the city. He uses the Board of Public Works to transform the city and the face of the city. He has all this development riding up Connecticut Avenue, and he really does transform the city. But in the process, he runs up this huge debt that Congress objects to, that many conservatives in the city object to, because that's going to lead to higher taxes. And I'm vastly simplifying this story, but the end result is by 1874, Congress is investigating Shepard. They find the tremendous overspending. He's basically, they gave him $6 million to spend. He spends 21, and they try to rein him in, and they rein him in by stripping the city of all elected government. Why do they do that? Well, the people that they blame for this corruption that they call, this overspending, all these terrible things of Reconstruction, they blame the black voter. They blame it on Negro suffrage, which is what it was called then. And they say, it's because of these ignorant Negro voters coming in. They accuse Shepard of paying them to come in and vote. And they blame the Negro voters, the black voters, for voting Shepard into office. Of course, Shepard wasn't voted into office; he was appointed. They blame them for voting in corrupt members of the elected government, the lower house, the House of Delegates that was elected, but there were only 2 black members out of 22 in that what they called the feather duster legislature, and they called it the feather duster legislature. And this becomes important. This becomes a shorthand for corruption and the excesses of Reconstruction, because when Congress strips away the vote, the House of Delegates is in an uproar. People are really upset by this. They've been fighting for this for years. They believed in it. And as a protest, they stripped all the stuff out of the chambers, out of their legislative chambers, down to the feather dusters that clean the House. They stripped everything out as a protest. They brought it all back the next day, but it was just it was a politically symbolic act. Their enemies turned this into further evidence of corruption. Say, see, you give folks the right to vote, you give black folks the right to vote, you get corruption, you get spending. It's too dangerous. Better to strip everyone of the right to vote, black and white, rather than let this happen again. And so by 1874, they've established a commission form of government, which was the original form back in the 1790s that was originally set up. You had 3 men appointed by the president to serve as commissioners of the city. There were no elections, not school board, not dog catcher, nothing. You basically couldn't cast a ballot. And people were very upfront in the 1870s about the racial implications on both sides. They understood very clearly the racial implications of this. And members of Congress said clearly, look, these folks basically are children politically. We are the parents. We're going to take care of them. You can't trust these ignorant voters. We need to assert control. And many radical Republicans, Charles Sumner and others, are outraged, and they're saying, look, we're the Republican Party. We advance the rights of black voters across the South. How can we now step back from this in our nation's capital? And they did. And it started as a temporary measure in 1874. It was made permanent in 1878, and we're still living with elements of that. 100 years later, we win back some of those rights, but it takes a century of fighting. So that's a long answer to the first part of your question.
How about the second part? No. Something else happened during that period, too, didn't it? That was interesting, I thought. When they created public schools, was that for white kids only?
It was, although there were attempts by Charles Sumner and others to create integrated schools. And in fact, in I believe it was Ward 4, the wards were different now than the wards we know, but there was an area where white parents and black parents themselves petitioned the school board to create an integrated school, because there weren't enough people, there weren't enough children to create 2 separate systems, because segregation is a very expensive. So
in essence, you had freed slaves paying income taxes to support a public school system that they couldn't participate in.
Well, there were black public schools that were being established at the time.
When? Before the Civil War?
No, not before the Civil War. No, this 1862 was when the first black public schools were established.
Stevens School, which I attended, was the first after the Civil War. But so you did have essentially blacks supporting a school system that they couldn't send their kids to.
Well, there weren't many whites going to public school either. But yes, this is before the war. But during the war in 1862, the Congress creates a public school system for black children as well, and mandates that the city council give money to the black system, which it doesn't do for the first couple of years. And finally, they have to repass a new law demanding that the council do its job and distribute the money in accordance with the numbers of students, black and white, to the school system. So it's really not until after the Civil War. It starts during the Civil War, and then after the war with Freedmen's Bureau schools and so forth, that you start to get a broad swath of black public schools that are initiated.
So you did have some myths develop as a result of black enfranchisement. To what extent do those myths carry on today? Do they work through to contemporary society?
Well, I'll talk about the early part, and then I'll let you. If I'm talking a lot, it's because I'm doing a lot of the 19th century stuff. Derek does more of the post-World War II stuff, but I'll talk about Reconstruction, then we can bring it to the modern day. I mean, this myth of Reconstruction, I mean, this very quickly hardens into incontrovertible truth among many conservative white Washingtonians and conservative whites across the South. This idea that Reconstruction was this dismal failure. There's this tragic era that we tried this experiment and it failed. This experiment in black voting, and this becomes this myth hardens into the reality in the minds of white Washingtonians, many white Washingtonians, to the point where anytime suffrage is brought up, anytime there's a movement, and there are movements. Like after 1878, it's not like district residents just sort of sat back and said, well, too bad, we'll just have to wait until they give us the right to vote. They didn't. There was an interracial alliance in the 1880s and 90s, especially with the white labor movement, that pushed very hard in the 1880s and 90s to bring back the right to vote. And it failed repeatedly because these myths of Reconstruction came back, and people said, oh, remember the feather duster legislation? We're not going to do that again. We tried that. Academic studies came out in the 90s and the early 1900s saying, look, Reconstruction was a failure. It was a failure because we let black people vote, and that created all this corruption. And a lot of these same tropes come up time and again in the Civil Rights era, in the Marion Barry era, and in the 1990s, where we hear this again. Well, we tried it and it failed. We gave them the right. They didn't live up to it. Well, now we need to take it away and assert control.
Derek, do you want to bring this forward a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think most people who are in the city today, when they think about corruption in D.C. government, think about the feather duster legislature, right? So that's sort of a myth that holds back the forces that are petitioning for home rule, or that are petitioning for statehood, sort of through the civil rights era. And the people who are really championing that narrative are, of course, Southern segregationists who are using D.C. as an example for all the land. D.C. is always being used as an example for all the land, for good or ill, by our friends and our foes. And Southerners really pushed that narrative through the Civil Rights era. But really, when we talk about corruption, we're talking about sort of the broken bureaucracy that folks inherit during the Home Rule era. And then, of course, the actions of Marion Barry's, particularly his second and his third administrations. His first, most people would argue, is a pretty impressive effort. And so it's that corruption, and really the personal corruption of Barry and his inability to fix the bureaucracy, and then after a while, his personal example beginning to filter down into the bureaucracy in the late 80s that people focus on when they're talking about corruption. And it is consistently used as a reason for not picking up legislation in Congress that would allow D.C. That would allow for, say, the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment, that would allow for statehood, which has usually been the push that we've made in Congress since 1978. And home rule activists have always said, well, you're not going to strip statehood from Illinois. You're not going to strip statehood from Louisiana. And that's true, but to a certain extent it doesn't matter, because Congress's ability to do one thing or another with D.C. is an exercise of raw power.
I seem to remember growing up here that home rule was opposed for the city even when this was a majority white city. I can recall in 1952, Eisenhower's inauguration, there were white kids lining the streets saying, give us ability to vote. I mean, the movement was not racially charged. Or let me ask the question this way. Were there any other reasons why there was opposition to granting full autonomy to the city beyond race? And let me tell you why I asked that question. When we did I was on the staff when we did the Home Rule Bill in 1973. Have I knocked it over yet? I'm getting close, huh? You're getting close. Yeah. And the Senate I was on the Senate District Committee as a staffer. We had passed home rule for the district 7 times. The problem had always been in the House. So we had no problem getting the bill out of committee. We took it to the floor. We felt that everything was lined up, everything was going to work out fine. And along came Senator Norris Cotton from New Hampshire, Republican, who offered an amendment that in effect said the President of the United States would appoint the chief of police in the district. It almost passed. We thought we had everything locked up. It almost passed. But why did he say that? Because he voted for home rule. He was reflecting a concern in some parts of the Congress, the same concern that grew out of Philadelphia, when the militia marched on the then Congress up there, and they didn't get a response. The pensioners marched on the Congress. They didn't get any response from the militia. They didn't get any support, and they said, we can't have this. We have to be in a location where we can control our own constabulary. Now, that wasn't racially motivated, but there was that concern that somehow the Congress would be left bare if he relied only on local authorities. Talk about that a little bit. What things did go on that may have been racially tinged, but they weren't completely driven by race?
Well, there's the constitutional objection, that constitutional purists or strict constructionists would look at the Article 1, Section 8 clause and say, this gives us the right to have power.
It gives the states exclusive jurisdiction.
Right, it gives Congress the exclusive jurisdiction over this federal district, which is why we're called the district. Interestingly, it says it can be no more than 10 miles square, but it doesn't say how small it can be, how small this district is. I mean, the people who charted the first commissioners charted it out to be a nice 10 by 10 diamond. We've since given the Virginia's part back, but it was intended to maximize that 10 miles square. But it never said actually how little it could be. And the federal district could be just the government buildings along the National Mall if they were so choose. But there are members of Congress who see this as a constitutional obligation and say that the only way to change this would be by constitutional amendment, that you would have to constitutionally amend the Constitution to provide for DC representation of some kind. And there have been various pushes over time to create that kind of constitutional amendment. So that's definitely one objection.
And another is just being able to use DC as a kiddie, either for policy positions. So it's a place where you can set down policy markers that you're eventually going to try and sell nationwide. Or it's just a place for jobs for constituents, right? People used to complain about all the West Virginians and South Carolinians in D.C. back in the 50s and 60s, and that's because you had people from West Virginia and South Carolina on the D.C. committees who would say to constituents back home, hey, you need a job? I got a job for you in D.C. And then you'd find all these people who would come here and be teachers and policemen. And one of the things that the Berry administration noticed when they came into office in the late 70s was that they would send out pension checks. And a huge number of those checks would be going out of state. And it was because all those people from other people's congressional districts and states had come here, gotten jobs, and then gone back home. And so the city was exporting huge amounts of money through its pension after it had gained home rule. So I think those two things also led a large number of people to hold on in Congress to hold on to the city. But in the end, if you're talking about the people who exercised control in making sure that home rule legislation did not get through, you're talking about segregationists, right? And so, you're over there on the Senate side pulling up all this legislation, and you've got, liberals who are just pro-growth folks, right? They want to be able to move urban renewal legislation easily, and they need a government to interact with to move urban renewal projects. Like the three commissioners aren't going to do it. So you have people, in the 50s who are interested just in that, getting home rule of some sort for that reason. You have other people who just find it offensive that the capital of the free world in the Cold War has people who cannot vote, and they're trying to move that legislation. But whenever they get it through the Senate, 6 times between 1948 and 1966, it gets blocked. And it gets blocked by John McMillan, segregationist from South Carolina, right? Before that, in the Senate, it was getting blocked by Theodore Bilbo during his very short reign as D.C. committee chairman. And they were unequivocal in their reason for doing it. I mean, they were glad to say it because they wanted the folks back home to know, I'm blocking this legislation because I do not want Negroes to vote. I don't want them to vote here. back in South Carolina, Mississippi, and I don't want them to vote in the nation's capital.
Control the nation's capital.
Yes, and that would, but when it comes right down to it, when you're talking about an organized group of people who attempt to block the vote in D.C., you're talking about segregationists.
And I would just jump in one thing here. So people would say, well, this is at a time, as you said, where blacks are not a majority, right? They were, up until the 1950s, they were 30% of the population, and people would say, well, they're only 30% of the population. Why are you so worried about them controlling the vote? Or what they called Negro domination was what they were worried about. And the segregationists would explain it very clearly. And sometimes these weren't just folks from South Carolina. They were the white commissioners who were running the city. They would say, look, this is a city of transient people, right? You got a lot of white people who vote back home. And so the actual white voting population is much smaller than it seems. It's not 70%. It might be closer to 40% of the voting population or 50% of the voting population. That plus the fact that they are split between Democrats and Republicans. And so if the white vote is split, then the black vote is going to hold the balance of power. And that's how the black vote would control the city. And so it does come down to these racial concerns about race and power.
Just to follow up on your point about how do you define the federal interest in the city, actually, it was defined in the Home Rule Act. When the bill went up on the floor in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Edith Green from Oregon proposed that there be a federal enclave that the district could not penetrate. And it's spelled out in the Home Rule Act by streets around the federal buildings. And they even had created the position of somebody who would be the director of the federal enclave. It just atrophied, but it's in the law. If you go in there and look at it now, it's in the law. And it was the kind of thing that Congressman Diggs, who was managing the Home Rule bill in the House, had to buy. He had to accept that kind of thing if he can get Edith Green to vote with him. It's just like budget autonomy question. The Senate had given the district budget autonomy, complete budget autonomy. But to get Bill Natcher, who was from Kentucky, who ran the Appropriations Committee, to vote for the bill, they had to give Congress final control over the district's budget. Once again, Charlie Diggs had to accommodate that, as far as the art of the possible, although we knew exactly what that would mean for the city, and we're fighting that even to the day. There's another question of home rule versus national representation that sort of is still with us now. Can you talk a little bit about that issue of home rule versus national representation?
And you mean home rule versus someone voting in Congress?
Having your own, no, home rule in the sense of self-government in the District of Columbia versus national representation in the sense of full voting representation in the Congress.
You want to take that first?
Yeah. So this divide comes out in the early 20th century. So we were talking earlier about this interracial movement to first win the right to vote for black men, and then after it's stripped away, to regain the ballot for district residents. This is very much an interracial movement made up of former abolitionists, radical Republicans, labor movement leaders, and so forth. By the 1890s, that generation is dying off, a different generation is coming in, and the suffrage movement basically peters out. And it's revived in the early 20th century primarily by elite white people, white elites like Theodore Noyes, who ran the Evening Star, and they're very interested in national representation as opposed to home rule. And so they start pushing for a constitutional amendment that would provide national voting rights, a representative for the district in Congress, because they were worried about the 50% federal contribution. And that was basically the deal in 1874 was, okay, we'll give up the right to vote, you pay for half of our budget. The federal government would pay for half the district budget because as the nation's capital, we have a much larger budget, we provide services for the whole country and so forth. That was what Congress agreed to. By the early 20th century, Congress is backing away from that. And white elites are worried about that, and they feel part of the reason they're losing that contribution is because they don't have anybody in Congress fighting for it. They don't have anybody who has a vote to trade. They don't have any power in Congress. So they push for a constitutional amendment. But they don't want home rule, because home rule is equated with, again, Negro domination, that they're worried about black people dominating local politics because of the size of the black population. And so they very clearly differentiate between the two. They support the one and not the other. And this separation goes right on through into the civil rights era, when civil rights activists are trying to bring them back together. But the Board of Trade supports national representation, but definitely not home rule.
And so I'll start with two things here, right? I mean, the first is that you see a real quick moment when there is a request for both home rule and national representation in the 1890s with this,
the 90s, yeah.
With A.E. Redstone, who forms a statehood committee. And if you look closely at the news coverage of Redstone's activities, it's only about 7 people that are part of this statehood committee. But they bring forward the idea, which had really petered out really quickly after the city had lost voting representation of any sort back in the beginning of the 19th century. And they say, we want to make D.C. a full-fledged state. And the idea of statehood sort of flares for a moment in the late 19th century with this small group of largely white elites, and then it disappears. You don't see the topic of statehood come up again until 1970. And the people who bring it forward are, of course, the folks who end up founding the statehood party. So Sam Smith, a sort of new left newspaper writer who's very active in the Capitol Hill area, writes a really short piece where he says, you know, a year ago there were some Black Power activists, among them Doug Moore, who becomes a city councilman, who say, we want statehood now, and using the language of Malcolm X, they say, you know, sort of by any means necessary. And everybody's thinking, oh, well, what's going to happen with these Black Power activists who are demanding statehood by any means necessary? And nothing happened. The group that they had put together to demand statehood now in 1969 just sort of falls apart. And so Sam Smith writes a really wonderful article in 1970 in his paper where he says, you know, statehood would be a great idea. I really think that we should push for it. And he gets like 1 or 2 responses, you know, letters to the editor, and it's like, hey, great article, but that's about it, right? And so it seems that this is going to happen again. The idea is going to come up and it's going to go away. But Julius Hobson wants to run for the delegate seat that's just been opened up in 1970. He's going to end up running against Walter Fauntroy. And Walter Fauntroy at the time is arguing for a multi-step process to get to full representation. So he's saying, look, let's work on getting home rule, and then we'll talk about the rest after that. And so Fauntroy is essentially, within his strategy, separating the two. He's saying, let's get home rule first. Once we get home rule, we'll use it as a stepping stone to get federal representation. Hobson says, quite to the contrary, no, we should demand statehood now. And so that battle line sort of crops up in this campaign in 1970. And it really becomes a really nasty campaign. I mean, one, because Julius Hobson is a pretty strong guy, and 2, because he really didn't have that much respect for Walter Fauntroy, and so the language between them got pretty rough. Fauntroy crushes Hobson in the election, and as far as Fauntroy is concerned, that's the end of it. He goes off, works on a remarkable strategy that first takes D.C. residents down to South Carolina to help people run against John McMillan, who is the head of the D.C. committee in the House. And they back a black candidate against him in 1970. That candidate loses. They go in search of a liberal white candidate who can beat McMillan in 72. And they're calling people, they're having church groups call people down in South Carolina. They're taking buses down there to activate voters. They're registering people. And John McMillan loses in 1972. And you all should see the video footage. I mean, Ralph Abernathy is coming into his district. Fauntroy is coming into his district, and he's on the cameras just like, I don't know what I did to these people, you know? And he loses in the election. Once he loses, Charlie Diggs, of course, becomes the chair of the D.C. committee in the House. And the legislation that had been being sent over from the Senate and blocked in the House now moves through, and we get the home rule bill. It's not perfect, but we have a home rule bill. Fauntroy then pivots roughly in 1975-76 and begins pushing for voting representation in Congress through a D.C. Voting Rights Amendment. And so it's going to be an amendment to the Constitution that allows for representation for the District of Columbia as though it were a state. So we're not going to have statehood, but we'll have representation as though it were a state. And Congress will still have say under the Home Rule Act. So it's a really complex piece of legislation. The whole time this is going on, and by the way, he passes the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment. He's able to get it through Congress in 1978. Goes out to the states and it loses, but it is one of the most impressive campaigns that self-determination activists put on in the 1970s. They were that close in certain respects from getting what would have been a majority black state, and as Fontre would have said, 2 black senators, increasing the number in the Senate to 3. And it turns out that the other black senator, Edward Brooke, was a firm backer of the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment, was in fact part of the Self-Determination for D.C. coalition. But the whole time that this is going on, Hobson is back here in D.C. and he refuses to let the statehood thing go. So right after Fontroy beats him in the election of 1970, he goes to his contacts on Capitol Hill and he says, "Hey guys, will you introduce a statehood bill?" And a congressman from Berkeley, California, Ron Dellums, backs it. Fontroy calls him and asks him to get rid of it. Hobson, undeterred, in 1972 goes to George McGovern and says, "Will you introduce a statehood bill?" And McGovern says, "Sure." Fontroy has Coretta Scott King call McGovern and say, "Please do not introduce this bill." At which point Fontroy says the biggest opponent of D.C. self-determination is not John McMillan, it's that damn Walter Fontroy. Of course, the next year, Fontroy has a strategy, and he's trying to get Hobson not to mess things up, right? And so the next year, the city gets home rule. Hobson, yet again undeterred, at this point is a member of the city council, pushes statehood legislation in the council. And this is where you get this really interesting dynamic where the council gives lip service to statehood, but is never willing to do anything to achieve it. So Fontroy puts forward this statehood bill in the city council.
Hobson was a member.
Hobson puts forward this statehood bill in the city council. Pardon me. And everybody signs on to it. Marion Barry signs on to it. Everybody signs on to it in the city council. And no one does anything to actually move it forward. And so he gets all these co-signers, and then he tries to bring it to the floor for a vote, and no one will vote it out of committee so that they can vote on it. And the Washington Post just calls their bluff, and they say you can't give lip service to statehood because you think your constituents want it, and then not actually advance the legislation. Shame on you, city council. City council just says it, whatever. And so it never moves forward, but Fontroy this whole time is pursuing his own track. Hobson is pursuing his own track. And it's really Fontroy and his gradualist forces that are hogging all of the money, all of the national attention, and they're better organized. And so they're able, during the 1970s, to dominate the struggle for self-determination locally.
So where are we now? And I ask the question because if you pick up the paper today, you'll see that the mayor is going to start an initiative to get budget autonomy from the Congress, and she's got a court decision behind her now that says that the city ought to be able to do that, can do that without congressional approval. What forces will come forward now to break that? Do you think this Republican Congress will step forward to stop it, or will they let it go?
It's highly possible, and I'll say this quickly so Chris can get in. Ted Cruz, early on in his campaign, tried to introduce education reform legislation, if you can call it that. He was basically trying to force D.C. To spend its own money on vouchers. Right now, the federal legislation that forces D.C. to have a voucher system does it with federal dollars. Ted Cruz says we should change that, or we should expand that, and we should make the city allow for more vouchers for D.C. children, but take it out of the city's budget. And so he's essentially passing federal legislation to force the city to spend its own money in the way that he deems correct. He did that as a campaign ploy. He doesn't really care what goes on in D.C. and he hoped it would be red meat for the folks back home. As he enters a contested convention, he may attempt to do that again. Well, I'll say this really quickly about what the mayor's doing. I think that the best way to move forward right now is in the courts, and certainly the city has done that as much as it can when it comes to budget autonomy. What I think will be a non-starter on the Hill is legislation that has to move through the Congress that would grant the city any expansion of self-governance. I can't imagine that would happen.
And it comes down to power. You have Republicans controlling both houses of Congress, and they're not about to give 2 senators and a representative to a largely Democratic city that no one could imagine in the foreseeable future anyway, voting in any Republicans. So to them, it's like handing their opponents a wonderful weapon. So they're not going to pass it.
Let's just talk a little bit about the dynamics of enacting the Home Rule Act itself. There's a perception that the bill moved in 1973 because of activism in the city, black activism in the city. From where I sat during that period, there clearly was something going on in the country that moved Home Rule Bill. And I think the Fauntleroy effort in the South, the Civil Rights Act itself, generated a lot of support for the bill because of empowerment of black voters in the South. But what I didn't see, and you tell me if this perception is wrong, was the kind of black activism driving the Home Rule Bill in 1973. There was a lot of institutional support for it. The churches, the clergy behind it, there were good government people behind it. You had people like Joe Rao involved with it. The old liberal establishment was behind it. But the people who were the activists had no presence on the Hill, even with Fauntleroy. I mean, Fauntleroy was the voice over the House, and people like Walter Washington would come up and testify and speak for it. But they were the ones who were representing the interests of the district at the time and who were being listened to.
Right. Well, I think there are a couple things going on here. Well, one is that the activists had helped change the conversation, helped change the context in the mid and late 1960s. And so you have Marion Barry coming into the city. He launches the Free DC movement. He very much makes home rule a central part of his effort. He links it very directly to both the civil rights movements and the Black Power movements. And so that process in the mid and late 1960s of basically taking over the home rule issue, linking it to the civil rights struggle, which is largely successful by that point in the rest of the South, and saying, wait a minute, how can we change Selma, Alabama, and we can't change Washington, D.C., right? How can black people vote there and not here? And so you have that linkage which empowers other folks, the Joe Rouse, the more establishment types. It empowers them to get conversations that they couldn't get before, and it opens doors that they couldn't get open before, where they were just completely shut out. But by the early 1970s, a lot of those activists, not Marion Barry, but a lot of other activists have tuned out. Right? They consider Capitol Hill completely corrupt. They think the political process is corrupt. They've disengaged from the political process. They don't want to go marching up on Capitol Hill and knock on congressional doors because they don't think that's effective. And so, this is not just black activists, but white activists of the left too have kind of disengaged from that institutional, internal baseball kind of game because they don't want to play it anymore. But the institutional activists do. Rouse there. You have new organizations promoting self-determination for D.C., which are made up of insiders, which are made up of Washington types who know the game, who know who the people to call, and who play it very well.
I mean, I think implicit in your question is a really important distinction about the time, right? The 1970s are legislatively a liberal high point on Capitol Hill. right? Whether under Nixon or under Carter. I mean, this is a moment when some really wonderful legislation is being passed by the Congress. And local self-determination activists ride that, right? Now, they don't just coast on it. I mean, they actually put together a very impressive lobbying organization. I mean, if you look at Self-Determination for DC, which is the main self-determination advocacy organization here in the city, you're talking about a group that includes the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Fauntroy's Congressional Office, and a number of other smaller players, as well as a large number of lobbyists, like this first generation of black lobbyists who are heading on to Capitol Hill, who are willing to sort of lend their time on the side to this effort. And they're, you know, whether it's in 73 or 76 when they try to get the DC Voting Rights Amendment through Congress, it fails. 78 when they get it through Congress, you know, they're buttonholing legislators. They're sitting down at the Common Cause office at their phone bank, and they're calling people in South Carolina, they're calling people in Arkansas, and they're asking them to call their members so that in those constituents in those states are then telling their members the DC Voting Rights Amendment means something to me. I mean, there's this wonderful moment in the debate over the DC Voting Rights Amendment in 1978, where Strom Thurmond, you know, ambles down to the floor and gives this rousing speech, where he ends by saying, you know, a vote for DC is a human rights issue and we have to support it. And then he goes back to his office, and it's not just rhetoric. He actually calls up all of these conservatives, Barry Goldwater and some others, and he says, I want you to sign on to the legislation. And that seems bizarre, positively bizarre. This is Strom Thurmond, for God's sake, right? And the reason that he had done it was because this very robust lobbying organization had taken advantage of the fact that Strom Thurmond was in the fight of his life in 1978, trying to get reelected to the Senate. Walter Fauntroy had called up Jesse Jackson and said, you know, Jesse, I need to make a deal with Strom Thurmond. And, you know, Jesse, of course, is a native son of South Carolina. They had called up all of the major churches in South Carolina. We need to make a deal with Strom Thurmond. And the deal was, we'll leave you alone in this very difficult re-election battle, which if we jumped in, we'd probably help you to lose. But we'll leave you alone if you back the DC Voting Rights Amendment. And Strom Thurmond did so. And Jesse called him up and said, I'm not coming to South Carolina. You can actually find this in his papers. Jesse called, today is not coming, right? And so you can see that they were terribly sophisticated, right? And were able to use the fruits of the 1965 Voting Rights Act to pressure people who were enemies, historically, of DC self-determination. The problem was, at the very moment where they had their most power, a grassroots conservative movement was bubbling up from the states. And the organization that is now a household word that leads the charge against the DC Voting Rights Amendment when it goes to the states for ratification was ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee? Council. And a woman named Donna Carlson, who was the chair of ALEC at the time, which, by the way, if you look closely, does not get mentioned in the New York Times before 1978. And the first time that ALEC gets mentioned by the New York Times is when it's opposing the DC Voting Rights Amendment. In other words, it becomes a national player in the conservative movement through opposing DC voting rights. And it sees DC voting rights as part and parcel of a liberal effort to mangle the Constitution so that liberals can be dominant in American politics. So they see it as part of the ERA. Right? They see it as a way that liberals are fundamentally reshaping the republic, and they have to be stopped here. So we're going to stop the ERA. We'll use the exact same people, Phyllis Schlafly, Pat Buchanan, to stop DC voting rights. Because if they get 2 black senators, we're going to get the ERA on the back end of it, so they say. Right? And so they go all out to defeat the amendment. It is defeated. The clock has run out in 1985, and it doesn't pass the states. And that conservative movement is not only able to defeat the DC Voting Rights Amendment, but is able to gain the White House for the Republicans, is able to gain the House of Representatives in 1994 for the Republicans, and has since metastasized and just full-on taken over the Republican Party, and has created a form of partisan gridlock that will be impossible to break for any DC self-determination activists. And so that liberal moment is gone. And so I don't mean to sound horrible about this, because I think that we have to be respectful of the contingency of history. But that moment where we could push this legislation through, the 70s, is so very different than the one in which we sit today. And unless something unforeseen occurs, the possibility of moving legislation of that sort through Congress, I don't think it matters how well organized we are locally. Like, something else needs to break on the national stage.
Let's stay local for a moment, though. How has the movement for broader self-determination changed in the city? And by that I mean some of the players that we talked about in the 70s and the 80s, the institutional players, are gone. They're off the scene, never to return again. They're dead. Well, they may return, but what's going on now? Who are the players in the city to coalesce this desire for more self-determination? Who are they?
So I mean, the players now are Eleanor Holmes Norton, Josh Birch, who's a neighborhood activist. And rather than name all the people, I think the major distinction that we have to recognize is that the big change between, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean necessarily the personalities. I mean the institutions that came to play. For example, the clergy were an important part of the self-determination movement in the 70s. They were sort of the face of it. Fauntleroy was being one of them. What do you see now when you look at this effort institutionally?
Well, institutionally, the churches are significantly diminished in their power, right? I mean, most of those churches have moved to PG County, and those that remain have far fewer parishioners. The distinction I like to point out is that the activists who were working in the 1970s were interracial, were power players in the Democratic Party, never were really able to find a good source of funding. They could never get the business community to get on board, right? But they were power players within Democratic politics by and large. And initially, even in Republican politics, right? The DC GOP and even RNC Chairman Bill Brock endorsed the DC Voting Rights Amendment in 1976, right? And these people understood that in order to get Congress to do anything, you have to talk to the folks back home. You have to talk to the constituents of these members of Congress. So you can't walk up to Capitol Hill and say, hey, out of the goodness of your heart, because it's right, will you give us power here in the district? And they say, get out, right? And so they were having constituents, people who could vote you in or out of office, demand DC voting rights from the states. After Fauntleroy leaves office in 1990, that strategy falls apart, right? And Eleanor Holmes Norton is focused on Capitol Hill. And she's been exceedingly smart about how she's operated on Capitol Hill, but she has absolutely no leverage. None, right? And so either she's able to find someone like Tom Davis who's willing to help her, or she's not. Mostly not, right? The same with many of the local activists. You know, Josh Birch is a wonderful neighborhood activist. And he takes people down to Capitol Hill to knock on members' doors all the time. Great, right? But they have no reason to back DC voting rights. And so I see the distinction as being one in which, you know, you actually had people who would figure out how to create leverage out of relatively powerless positions, right? And a group of people now who are really playing within the rules, and those rules leave DC powerless.
Okay, so that's a wonderful place for us to stop. And thank our guests and open the floor for a Q&A.
If you have a question, yeah, please.
Okay, I have one hand over here.
Hi, my name is Marsha Russell, and I'm a native Washingtonian also, and I was born in Garfield Hospital before it was gobbled up by Hospital Center. And
Columbia Hospital.
And recently I read a wonderful book about one of our lesser-known presidents, John Garfield. of Garfield Hospital. And I'd like to know if before his assassination, did he, like John F. Kennedy, our last assassinated president, have anything on the books, because he was considered a radical Republican, did he have anything on the books that maybe he had plans to work with D.C., any of D.C.'s affairs?
Well, not really. By that time, the Republican Party is starting its retreat away from Reconstruction. And even if he had at one point sympathized with the radicals, he was not a radical, like capital R radical. He was not from the Sumner wing of the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party, even when the radicals were at their most powerful, they were never a majority. They were always a small part of the Republican Party that for a brief time in the immediate post-Civil War period were able to exert power far out of proportion to their numbers, just because it was after the war. People were still very emotional, very angry about what happened, saw this as an opportunity to do some extraordinary things. They gradually lose power within their own party through the 1970s. Historians like to talk about the Compromise of 1877.
1870s.
What? 1870, right. The Compromise of 1877, where Republicans allow the troops federal troops to be taken out of the South.
That was Hayes,
right,
Rutherford Hayes.
Rutherford B. Hayes, in order to win the presidency. And so what you're seeing is that the National Republican Party, and this starts in D.C. with the retreat from democracy in D.C. That's when the Republican Party starts to retreat from its radicalism and start to take steps away from its push for racial egalitarianism and move in other directions. And so by the 1880s, National Party leaders are largely unwilling to embrace that kind of racial egalitarianism. And so certainly Garfield was not as radical as he could have been.
And by the way, and there's
and he didn't have much time.
There are always echoes of this more egalitarian moment in the party's history. So Arthur Capper, a senator from Kansas, chairs a D.C. committee in I want to say it's the 20s, it might be the teens, and he advances legislation. I mean, he tries to push legislation to give D.C. home rule. It just never makes it out of committee. Right, and so you have, and he was very clear on sort of his abolitionist background, right, and so this Plains radical. He understood himself as a Plains radical, but he couldn't move his larger party to a position of that sort, and he was of course rewarded with the naming of Capper dwellings after himself. The name took on different connotations later on, and they've now been demolished. But nonetheless, those people do pop up. They just can't move the party.
Yeah, I do. Thanks. My name is Peter Uffland. I'm a professor at UDC. I just have it's a very history question. Just something that I was curious about in regards to the removal of home rule in 1874. Mm-hmm. Do you know the exact timing on that? The only reason I bring this up, and it was a nice segue with the question in regards to James A. Garfield. I mean, you're talking about the limitations of home rule issues and full representation for D.C. today. The fact is, in 1874, for the very first time since the beginning of the Civil War, the Democrats win the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And through the rest of what we might call the Reconstruction era, and I would argue continuing into the 1880s, there are plenty of Republicans with sentiments that are in favor of enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendment. Mm-hmm. They just can't control Congress because they only control one house or the other. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious as to the exact timing of that.
It was in June. I don't know the exact date, but I believe it was June 1864. So it's before those elections, and it's a huge vote. It's a large majority of Congress that votes in favor of stripping D.C. of its power. So it wasn't strictly party line vote. And in fact, it happens 2 weeks after a congressional report comes in damning the Shepard administration for its profligacy. And so it moves very quickly at that point in response to the investigation. But it's mid 1874.
Okay, so I mean, just as a thought, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
In looking, is there extensive debate on it or not? Because
not really.
My only question would be that if that happens before the 1874 congressional elections in which the Democrats controlled the House.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it'd be interesting to see what they're actually saying, because it could be that they're actually concerned with the Shepard administration. I'm not
Sure.
in any way challenging, and certainly I don't doubt for a second that white Washingtonians,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry, that white
Right.
Washingtonians are in favor of returning rule back to Congress.
Oh, sure. Oh, there's plenty of white elite support for what's going on. Absolutely. No, there's plenty of that, and the members of Congress. A lot of them have electoral considerations in mind. And again, this is 1874. We're almost a decade past the Civil War. There are lots of folks in the Republican Party, including Alexander Shepard, who say, we got to get past this race stuff, right? It's over. We did it, right? And now let's talk business, right? Let's talk economic development. That's the main issue. And so there was plenty of sentiment that wanted to just be rid of all that. And the idea was that by disenfranchising the district, by placing the government in the hands of commissioners, then you would take all the dirtiness out of politics. You would take the politics out of governance, right? And then you could have expert rule, and then it would be much easier and more efficient, more harmonious was the term they always would use, more harmonious to get things done. Right? This was an era of big projects. You wanted to get things done, and it's a lot easier to do that when you only have to deal with 3 people as opposed to a whole city of voters. It's a lot easier to do that if you don't have to worry about elections.
And there weren't 3 autonomous people. They were appointed
Right.
by the federal government. The federal government's hand was really into the district at that time and stayed in there.
Right.
Okay, we have one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Hal Wackman. Thank you very much for this evening. The question is, what happened to the deal concerning Utah? Will the D.C. get some representation and Utah get some representation? Clearly it died, but what happened?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, let me see if I can remember this correctly. So, the main thing that happened was that Jason Chaffetz made that deal a cornerstone of his campaign against the incumbent who had brokered it with Eleanor Holmes Norton. I can't remember his name.
Tom Davis.
And was able to sort of turn it into an actual electoral issue back in Utah, which was impressive in and of itself, and then wrote it right into D.C. The other problem, quite frankly, was that without Davis pushing it hard, and he did, without sort of people wanting to vote for it because of their connection to him on the Republican side, there's absolutely no reason for Republicans to back it, because you just wait it out 3 years and you get the seat anyway, right? And you actually saw some think tanks advocating waiting it out. Like there's no need, we don't need to give DC a seat, which we will have trouble revoking, just to have a Republican seat 3 years early, right? But you add to that sort of the pressure from Chaffetz, who made a note of when he got here refusing to rent an apartment. He slept in his office for months and blogged about it and put videos online. I mean, he made DC an issue, and folks back home responded, put Davis out of office, put him in. And he has since essentially said, the only thing I would consider when it came to home rule would be retrocession. And because retrocession has no local support by and large, it's a non-starter, which then sort of takes him off the hook, right? So you might want to add, though, Colby.
Oh, I know. I see Sharina here.
Hey, hello. Okay. So please join me in giving our panel another round of applause. Thank you for coming. You all have surveys. Please take a moment to fill those out, and please join us right across the hall and have a few libations before you hit the road.
And buy some books.
Oh, and buy some books.
Hey, good man, good man.
Stop these folks in the hallway and ask them more questions. Thank you all for coming, and please take a look at what we have to offer throughout the weekend and come join us again for another session. Thank you so much.